This lecture here, you see in the background, this is the technology of my youth, Oregon Trail. It's usually how it ended up, dying of some terrible thing. And indeed, this lecture is about not Oregon Trail specifically, but the kind of westward expansion and that is outlined in Chapter 12 of our AMSCO textbook, so 1830 to 1860, territorial and economic expansion. Westward expansion in this time period is most often associated with the phrase manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is something that, however, you can apply to the Louisiana Purchase. You could apply it to any number of westward expansion, any number of events of westward expansion or settler colonialism before and after 1845, when the term is actually coined by John O'Sullivan. In Irish, ironic, of course, because it's a lot about Anglo-Saxons that would be, and someone like O'Sullivan would come up with it. Annexation is an argument for annexing Texas and later Oregon, basically that the United States needed this territory. It was going to get it one way or another. The term manifest destiny is about the quote-unquote Anglo-Saxon race. That's not actually a real thing, but it's a phrase that is very common in this time period, and it basically means white people, not including a lot of different groups that we would consider white. Like, for example, as I said, O'Sullivan Irish are just kind of becoming white in this time period. Certainly Italians or Greeks wouldn't be included. But this is the quote from John O'Sullivan, and it is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. This is, you think about that phrase, right? Manifest destiny, and it behooves us to stop and unpack it for a second, right? That your destiny is something that is, right, meant to happen. And making it manifest, making it real, there's a very strong religious connotation to this. And this is no surprise, because there's three main elements that inform the idea of manifest destiny. And the first is the idea that Americans, or the Anglo-Saxon race, are God's chosen people, right? So this has long-standing roots, or I guess that's a mixed metaphor, has deep roots, or long-standing tradition in the United States, all the way back to the Puritans, this idea that the Puritans thought they were chosen by God to complete this a certain mission. And then likewise, in the mid-19th century, this idea that the Anglo-Saxons are God's chosen race, right? That the Americans, the English, they're chosen by God to do whatever they want. So that's one element of manifest destiny, a religious and Puritan element. The other element of manifest destiny is a kind of economic one. It goes back to John Locke, the English political economist. This idea that you make the land yours by using it. And the thinking was that Native Americans were not using it in the right way, right? That in order to actually commingle your labor with the land, you need to plant corn in neat straight rows and put up a fence and all of this. None of this stuff was common practice in Native American agriculture. They were very much engaged in improving the land in various ways, but they were not ways that were recognized as the English as having anything to do with ownership. So that's the second element of manifest destiny. And then the last one is a long-standing political tradition of this idea going all the way back to Jefferson, that agrarian democracy needs space. We need space to have all these farms and to have free, independent, Republican citizens. Obviously, the other side of this is the expropriation or the theft of Native American land. In this GIF here, you see from the early 19th century to the late 19th century, how much Native American land disappears, right? The blue being, the entire continent is native at one point. But from 1776, right, again, the proclamation line of 76, all the way on to the late 19th century, you see how all of that Indian homeland disappears, and then the creation of the reservation system, and then even reservations disappear. So you see Oklahoma, as large part, was supposed to be a reservation. The Black Hills and the Dakotas were supposed to be reservations. And then as various resources are discovered on this land, even that land is taken from Native Americans. Mount Rushmore is obviously one of the most maybe infamous examples here, that Mount Rushmore had always been a sacred place to Native Americans of that region. And it was actually, the thinking was that actually there were images of their elders in the rock face itself. So obviously a huge blow when it was taken, and then, these, various American presidents were carved in the rock face. Okay, so let's talk about Texas. I don't particularly care about Texas history. Maybe this is me being kind of California-centric in my teaching. And the only reason we really need to know about it is because it kind of Texas stands in the way of American history, so we have to address it. Texas, in some ways, is in the perfect spot for a conflict as the English and then the Americans push west. Mexican, Spanish, and then later Mexicans are looking to push north. The thinking is, if you're Mexico in 1819, Moses Austin sees a good opportunity to buy land cheaper in Texas than it was in Louisiana, at the 10th of the cost. And he goes there and wants to buy the land. He dies. His son negotiates a treaty. He brings a bunch of people, and the Spanish think this is a great idea because they want to protect their more developed parts of their colony from the Comanche, who I'll show you on a map in a second where they are located, but had always been a kind of thorn in the side of the northern parts of Spanish colonial settlement. So you move in these, Anglos, and the Comanche can attack them, and they can fight the Comanche, and it keeps more developed areas of your colony safer. Well, Mexico declares and is granted, they fight for and gain their independence in 1821, and they start trading with the United States along the Santa Fe Trail, which goes between Missouri and New Mexico. Here you see the Santa Fe Trail here, right outlined in red. And then the Camino Real. This overview here is the area kind of known as the Great American Desert. It's largely looks like, at least in the 19th century, looked like this. The next slide here. Tall native grasses, very few trees, very windswept, very, very dry, because it is a region that is in what would be called the rain shadow of the Rockies. You have the Rocky Mountains here. Moist air comes in, it is elevated by the mountains, it falls in the Rockies, and what comes down on the other side is very, very dry, very windy. It's a very dry and windy area. So this is the kind of the stomping grounds of the Comanche Indians. This kind of area, buffalo are everywhere, and its long grasses are everywhere. So it makes sense for the Spanish and then later the Mexicans to say, yeah, put these, if these people want to go live there, then let them. That's good for us. This is an image of an area that has been restored, I think in Nebraska, an area that has been restored. We'll talk more about this region when we get into the Great Depression. This is the area where we get the Dust Bowl, because it was once they developed plows that were strong enough to plow this land up, it turns out that the soil was incredibly agriculturally productive. Obviously, it had developed over thousands of years. The bad news is, of course, that it's very windy and all the soil eventually blows away. But more on that when we get to the 1930s. So back to the mid-19th century. Mexico abolishes slavery in 1829. Obviously, the Texans who want enslaved labor and cheap land don't like this. General Santa Anna comes to power in 1833. He's a strong man, leader. He opposes American slavery also. He cancels trading along the Santa Fe Trail. We're going to fast forward through all the Texas history. Yes, the Alamo and all that kind of stuff happens. They have a war. They have independence. And then you have this Republic of Texas, 1836. Sam Houston is the president of this new independent republic. Congress doesn't want to deal with this issue because the idea is it's a slave state and it's going to upset the balance of power. So they put the idea of making Texas a state on hold. Until 1844, when you get James Polk as the president, he is an expansionist. He wants to add all of this territory all the way to the Pacific to the United States. And Texas comes into the Union as a slave state. And we'll talk more about how they deal with that, how they balance that out in class. So now Texas is on board, part of the United States, but that is not all that Polk wants. He wants, again, all the way to California. He offers to buy it, and that offer is denied. So Polk says he wants to go to war. So this is kind of like your money or your life kind of thing. Offers to buy it. Mexico says no, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's not the answer. That's not the right answer. Try again. They go to war. They basically want to start a war with a border fight. American soldiers were killed by Mexican soldiers. It's just a question of where. Did the soldiers cross into Mexico and were they killed there? Or were the Mexican soldiers cross into Texas and were they killed there? We don't know. But Polk uses this as an excuse, saying, look, war is already happening, so let's get at it with a declaration of war. And that's what happens with the Mexican-American War. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., this is a minor thing, the Wilmot Proviso. It's only important insofar as it tries to subvert the gag rule. The gag rule was something that basically said that Congress couldn't talk about issues involving slavery. This was to avoid the conflict, the inevitable conflict around slavery. So basically, you can't talk about it. The Wilmot Proviso is something that is put into a number of bills that says that they will not extend slavery to the lands taken by Mexico in the Mexican-American War. It never passes. It's always removed from the bills. But it's a way to keep the debate about slavery alive, even though you can't talk about it. The United States eventually does win, and Mexico signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War, and then the United States gets California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, all of this territory, right? Effectively, basically what the map looks like now, with a couple small exceptions. California enters as a free state. This is kind of like from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 to the discovery of gold in 1849. It's kind of like, cue the Larry David music for Mexico, because they kind of, it's unfortunate that, a year after they give away the territory, of gold is discovered. And then we'll talk about the compromise of how California is let in with a compromise in 1850. But for the sake of quickness, we'll go through and just move on to Oregon. Oregon Territory, everyone wants it. Spain wants it, Mexico, Russia, Great Britain. They've all made claims to it. Russia is kind of not really relevant by this time period. What is the Oregon Territory is a matter of much debate. There's this idea, a phrase of 5440 or fight, that is up here the extreme U.S. claim, basically all the way to Alaska, right? So all of what is now British Columbia and Canada. This was the extreme American claim that the United States wanted all of that. The British wanted all the way down to here, which is a lot closer to what is basically Oregon now. And a little bit of review. The 49th parallel, which is right here in the middle, had already been established due to the Rush-Bagot Accord in 1818. So like when you think of the map of the United States, we'll go to the next slide here, right? You see here, Rush-Bagot establishes this here, basically saying that this line, 4940, the 49th parallel, is this northern part between Canada and the United States. That's the border. So that has already been established. There's this idea, right? Monroe Doctrine. Again, we don't want European powers meddling in the Americas, so we don't want to have England or Spain or anyone else messing around with the United States. Very presumptively assumes it's its own territory. And effectively, there's a compromise in the end. British and U.S. jointly occupy it for a while, and the final compromise does just that, right? Establishes the border at the 49th parallel, with the exception, of course, being Vancouver Island, which is Canada, right? Even to this day, that is the case. That's how the border is laid out. This is not super important stuff, the Oregon Territory stuff, but it is important to just kind of, as we look at this map, understand the general overview, right, that we have from the earliest settlements in Virginia and in Massachusetts, pushing out the 13 colonies, the Proclamation Line of 1776, the Northwest Ordinance, which establishes this territory as potential states, Indian removal under Jackson here, and then further pushing west, the Louisiana Purchase, obviously earlier in 1803, creates all of this as potential states. Texas we've reviewed. Mexican-American War is this, and then Oregon is that. And that basically gives you effectively the map, with the exception of Alaska, which is the 1860s, and Hawaii, which is the late 1800s. That is the map of the United States. And all of this stuff with Texas, with Oregon, the Mexican-American War is genuinely important. It's an important historical event, and it hints at larger imperial ambitions that the United States will continue on in the 19th century. But the big takeaway is just to try to understand where we got to. I mean, literally for people in California, right? How you got to where you are, and you're in the United States and not, Mexico or the California Republic. I know Gavin Newsom has called the California the nation state of California, but we're not there yet. Who knows? Maybe by the time you watch this lecture, we will be. But at this point, as of July 6th, 2020, we're still, right, part of this longer lineage. So that is a brief lecture on westward expansion in the 1830s and 40s. And we will continue talking about some of these westward expansion and sectionalism in class.